Sanguine, which can be a real pain because Sanguine actually heals vertical mobs as well. So like if you're a floor above where a Sanguine pool is, that'll also end up healing and doing damage to you. So it's a Teeming and Volcanic are pretty tame affixes for this dungeon, so I'm interested to see how big they're going to go. And here we go, right into this first room here. I expect them to pull just about everything into the boss so that those Unholy DKs can really do some damage here.
Yeah, we definitely see Divine Fields already on the mound, just trying to gather all of the trash here. I assume on top of the boss as well. And we'll see how they do with their double DK. This trash should die really quickly as they do engage Sanguine and also pop their Bloodlust from both sides, actually.
Yeah, and something interesting we saw on the side of Team Perplexed there, we saw Swagstep actually run into the sewer there and grab some of those mobs as well. There was a little bit of extra mobs pulled into the boss, and you can see the power of the double Unholy DK actually pulling the boss 15 to 20% lower for Team Perplexed here, and that's just the power of the Unholy DK, having two people on your team doing 2.5 million DPS versus just one. The major difference, though, you have that Hunter later on in the dungeon when you have those long single target bosses, it could actually end up bringing them back.
Yeah, Hunter is very popular now, especially for the time trials. And I've talked to some of the teams. They said Hunter just scales so well with the corruption, with the crit that they can choose on the tournament realms, and it just constantly has cooldowns up. So very, very consistent, high AOE damage and very high single target damage as well, which might actually benefit them later on, as you mentioned. But Perplex already on 3%. They're gonna down Sand Queen now any second, and as you mentioned, Puolukka just a little bit behind in that single target damage.
Yeah, it looks like they beat the second upheaval cast too, which is a big time save. You can see the second upheaval's happening for Team Puolukka right now, and they have to just sit there and wait for the boss spawn. That's about 5 to 10 seconds of downtime, and as we know in these MDI settings, those 5 to 10 seconds can add up quickly. Every single death also 5 seconds, so you really want to make sure you're beating these tiny little breakpoints to make sure you can get through as quickly as possible.
Yeah, and we will see how they handle these pillars here. As you can see, Puolukka is struggling to get this last percent down from the Sand Queen, having this extra upheaval, meaning they can't DPS the boss, but they also skip the pillar, so they're not actually playing the pillar next to the Sand Queen here. While Perplex is actually playing this drop light here, which can be very dangerous, especially in Dagor, because it's very narrow hallways and it spawns these pools on the floor that do damage you when you stand in it. It spawns pools underneath the boss, and it also spawns 2 pools underneath random players. So with very limited space, it can cause you to having, like, maybe you can't move anywhere anymore because there's pools in front of you and pools in the back. So you definitely need to be careful, especially also with these tentacles that cast a single target channel on random targets that do a lot of damage and also slow you.
Yeah, and I don't think it's too surprising that they're dealing with this obelisk as well, instead of deciding to try to skip it and go to the final boss. I don't think there's really any good way to deal with those Blood of the Corruptor pools on the ground when you're on the final boss, because all of that extra movement that you have to do will instantly stack up your debuff and make you get stunned, which is not what you want to do on that boss at all. Now, of course, the second they come out of the obelisk, you see that Smok instantly pulled the boss through the wall, and they're already on to Just Hallis. They're not going to be dealing with any of the trash in this room until the boss phases from phase 1 to phase 2.
Yeah, that's actually a very quick strategy here to pull that portal out on Just Hallis. Now, they were on the other side, as you mentioned, so they pulled it through the wall, and once Just Hallis actually goes to 70%, stuns everybody, he will run all the way back, as you see it happening right now, and open those cages, and then he will come back. So we'll see how they deal with the second phase of the boss, as you see a thing from beyond actually hitting one of the players here.
Yeah, and I mean, a typical like live key pushing strategy is just to not deal with the boss at all and deal with all the trash that he spawns afterwards. But I don't think we're going to see that when you're running a double Unholy DK comp. I think they're going to instantly interrupt the boss and just get some massive AoE out, and you're going to see those Unholy DKs rise to the top. So as Just Hallis comes back to his ending position right here, we're going to see how much damage they're going to be able to do to the boss here.
Yeah, they gotta be a little bit careful when they do these kind of pulls. As you see, Divine Field drops super low, but he's using his cooldowns now to stay alive. But as I wanted to mention that a pull like this can be very dangerous because there's a bunch of mechanics that can pull trash through the walls, especially things like Twilight Devastation can do. They need to be careful with. So we'll see. Hopefully nothing goes wrong and they can finish off this pull as Just Hallis is dropping really fast.
God, Jess got absolutely annihilated there. Like, it was like 60% to 30% instantly with all the trash dead, and like we mentioned, those Unholy DKs rising to the top, doing almost 20 million damage each in that AoE. Just absolutely ridiculous. And I think this is, you know, a trend that we're going to see more and more this season, are a lot of Unholy DKs, because back in the Beguiling Affix season last year, we saw a lot of teams only run one Unholy DK in a lot of dungeons because they couldn't really benefit from double Unholy DK. They had to pull pretty small because there were Beguiling mobs blocking a lot of packs. In this affix, that doesn't happen. You can kind of pull as big as you can and just let the Unholy DKs go wild.
So we saw a pretty nice skip coming out from Perplexed here. They were using their Shadow Melts to de-aggro all of the mobs they were pulling as they were running up, and then they used their Shroud to skip even more mobs. And now we're gonna see the setup for the cannon area. You see the mobs are being pulled, they're being CC'd, and once they are ready with the cannons, they're gonna pull everything together and try to AoE them down with the 5 shots that they have. Let's see how big of a pull they're doing here.
Yeah, I'm actually really interested to see this as well. I mean, this is one of the parts of the dungeon that we saw a lot of teams fail at, especially after that change to the cannons only having 5 shots last season. It requires a lot of stacking up by the tank here. You can see Divine standing right inside that doorway to make sure he gets stuff as stacked up as possible. We'll probably also see the Ring of Peace come out from Zmok as well at the last second just to make sure things are stacked. But so far so good. There's the Ring of Peace, got the second cannon shot hitting just about everything, and this is about as textbook as it gets right now.
Yeah, that was a beautiful Ring of Peace coming out to also just prevent the mobs from running any further, so the cannon shot actually hits all of them. Now, I think they used all 5 shots, so they have to finish off the rest of the HP from these mobs like that, but they hit almost all of them with all shots, so very well executed by Perplexed here, as they're going to be moving on, and they still have 2 cannons left, and we will see what big of a pull they do with those cannons. They're already on 68%, 69%, 71% of trash now, and 0 deaths, a very clean run by them so far.
Yeah, I mean, they just got rid of 40% of the trash with those 5 cannon shots, and they only really had 2 or 3 mobs to clean up afterwards. And I think with the limited cannon shots, that's about as good as it gets. I don't think I've ever seen a team after the change to the cannons make it that, you know, actually kill all of the mobs that they pulled with those 5 cannon shots. And now they have to do it once again, and you can see how dangerous this is. They're pulling so many mobs. Divine has to do a lot of kiting here to make sure things are perfectly stacked up. He's line of sighting around the corner as well just to make sure they get stacked up. And once again, they're doing a fantastic job. It looks like just about everything is dying, and if I'm not mistaken, they still have 2 cannon shots left to deal with everything. Wow, that was perfect.
Yeah, it looks so easy when a team like this pulls it off, right? But there's so many difficult things when you set up this pull, because these mobs, of course, they also have range abilities. They can silence you. They can just one-shot you as well if you have aggro, and it's very dangerous to stay in line of sight. So you need to be perfectly positioned. The rogue needs to make sure that you have the tricks of the trade on the tank, so the rogue does not actually have aggro, because even though you are in the cannon, you can still get hit by abilities and you can still die. So sometimes the rogue needs to go out, use his cloak, and go back in to not die. So very well executed by Perplexed. And it seems like they're actually playing the tank faster here, since they don't actually have a hunter, so it's going to be very hard for them to deal with this boss on the last boss. We'll see what the other team does. Maybe they're actually going to skip them up and play with the last boss, since they do have the hunter for them.
Yeah, I think once again, when you talk about Overseer Korgus with these obelisks, it's probably one of the most difficult final bosses in the dungeon to deal with multiple obelisks on. They got rid of, so far, both of the 2 obelisks that provide area of denial here. The Blood of the Corruptor, of course, putting those pools on the ground like we described earlier. In the Breaker of Heroes, the Tank Buster also does that Circle Dark Fury that you would have to move out of as both melee and probably ranged, because the typical strategy we see is people stacking in a corner. So removing both of those from the fight makes it so you shouldn't have to move too much on Korgus, and you should be able to cleave everything down pretty easily.
Yeah, and just to go back again to the Awaken affix here, in case some of you guys don't know, if you don't actually click on the pillar and you deal with the Awaken mob in the normal dungeon flow, then they actually spawn with the last boss. As soon as you engage combat with the last boss, they will spawn. They won't spawn the small little ads that you usually have when you click on the pillar on the obelisks, so you don't have to deal with those. But the mobs will spawn and you have to deal with them, and as Syro mentioned, it's just very difficult to do on Korgus because it's such limited space and you can't really move because else you'll get stunned. We see Puolukka actually are also in the cannon area now. They do have 2 deaths on the way here, so definitely quite a bit slower in comparison to Perplexed. But again, it is the first seed versus the number 8 seed, so they're still doing really well for that matter.
And it's important to mention that Team Puolukka did not do nearly as good of a job with the cannon as Team Perplexed did. They have 3 mobs left, all at about 50% or more HP by the time the cannon shots were done. Team Perplexed had maybe 1 or 2 mobs left on this pull, so just a little bit more practice, a little bit more clean from Team Perplexed on this pull. Not to mention they're a solid, probably minute ahead in the dungeon right now with Knight Captain Valeri going down.
Yeah, so we'll see what they do with the last 8% of the trash that they need here still. We know they still have 2 Awakened mobs that they have to deal with the boss, and they still need a little bit more trash here as well. Sometimes we saw some of the teams do the boss first and then deal with the trash afterwards, but seems like Perplexed is just dealing with this trash straight away, as they also have cooldown on Bloodlust still, so they probably want to wait for the Bloodlust to be ready, because they have to deal with those obelisk mobs as they engage Korgus as well.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, this is kind of a callback to last season. Like, you remember at the beginning of last year, we had a Waycrest Manor where Method EU timed their third Bloodlust to be right on their final pull of the dungeon, and they just didn't have it, and they ended up going a lot slower because of it. So
Yeah.
I wouldn't be surprised to just see them wait here for 20 seconds to wait for their Bloodlust to come up, like you mentioned. And you can see that pillar right behind him, that obelisk, that's going to spawn one of the mobs as well. There's a second one at some point in the room, and they'll have to come together on top of the boss and cleave it down.
They're just so fast. You can see them waiting around. As you see the total time at the bottom, they're only 10 minutes and 20 seconds in the dungeon now, so incredible fast. And now they did engage the boss. You see the fear coming out from the fear mob, and you also see the spider, which needs to be interrupted. If it's not interrupted, there's a huge initial damage on a random target that gets selected by it, so you want to make sure that you do interrupt all of them. Now they do have triple melee and one tank, so very short cooldown on interrupts, so they should be able to do it.
You can see those shadow debuffs going out on multiple players in the group. One's on Ashine and one on Divine Field. When that runs out, they'll get feared. Now, they do have the revival to get rid of all of them immediately. The DKs can also AMS it. There's a lot of things they can do to get rid of those fear debuffs, so they shouldn't be in too much trouble based off those fear debuffs from the void. Sorry, not from the void, but from the other mob. But they actually cleaved down the fear mob first, so they must have been scared of, maybe the fourth or fifth set of fears, because they can just interrupt the spider down easily. So they're not really focusing the spider that much at all here, which is, I think, kind of surprising.
I think it's because they have so many interrupts and you really don't have to move a lot on this boss. So as long as you have a focus macro, focus kick macro, and a proper rotation, it really should not be as big of a deal. Now, Korgus, on the other hand, is a much bigger deal because we all know that this boss can do a lot of damage to the group on top of having to deal with the fear from the fear mob. So that's why they probably nuked that one down. As you mentioned, they do have a bunch of abilities to get rid of the fear with the revival, and we have AMS, Cloak of Shadows, and so on. So they probably just want to get a certain amount of fears out, and then they don't want to get any more, because if you get feared in a bad situation here, it can definitely cause some problems, as you can get feared into a one-shot, or you get feared into an explosive burst from another person. So we see an actual double explosive burst coming out here, which is the one thing that is very dangerous on this boss, but it is a fortified setting, and Smok is doing a really good job healing it.
And it's also important to mention how much more dangerous this boss is when you pull it at this certain spot. You saw Swag just had to move into the boss after the pinwheel sort of pattern that the boss does in order to dodge the cannon shot. When you're standing in this position, you actually have to dodge the cannons, and the normal positioning we see for Korgus, you don't have to. But no problem for Team Perplexed as Korgus goes down. They have their last trash count from those obelisk mobs, and I mean, that was just textbook clean dungeon for Team Perplexed.
Was absolutely incredibly well played by Perplexed. They take game number 1 against Puolukka in Dagor, and as you guys were just mentioning, there's ironic. It's just that clean play, it's that strong execution that we've really come to know to expect from Abracadabra, now Perplexed on this one. And Settles, that was just over 10 minutes. Like these are some of the fastest dungeons that we're going to be seeing.
12:20 is the final time for that Dagor. And for a dungeon on a 19, even though it is fortified, 12 minutes and 20 seconds is insane. Samrak the Beckoner being played with Overseer Korgus there at the very end. Perplex just ran this dungeon freakishly fast. Their dungeon was super clean. I actually liked how they played Urgroth, the Spirit Breaker guy, and Blood of the Corruptor also prior to Overseer Korgus, just to make sure that their run was going to be as clean as possible. Puolukka didn't even look that bad. Puolukka was just slightly slower than Perplexed, and I think it has something to do with the double DK comp versus the Death Knight Hunter, and just how quickly Sand Queen ended up going down and how Perplexed was pulling relative to Puolukka. Overall, both of these teams, though, looked stellar.
Without a doubt, and the entire series that we have coming up, I mean, Freehold and then Waycrest to follow, with King's Rest to follow, that there's just so many opportunities for these double DKs to just really shine, ironic.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about it so many times throughout the dungeon. You can really just deal with a lot of these trash pulls in the dungeon running a double Unholy DK now. We saw some of these ridiculous burst numbers. On the first boss on Sand Queen, we saw both DKs easily over 3 million DPS and instantly bursting the boss down to 50 or 60%. It's just so powerful in the current context of this affix that it's going to be seen in a lot of dungeons going forward.
So, expanding on that, Perplex actually ran Rogue Hunter DK in their Freehold during time trials, and Puolukka ran Rogue Double Hunter. So I think we're actually going to see a lot less DK than initially thought.
Well, that's what I was about to say, is that, like, for Toldagor, it definitely makes sense to be running those Unholy DKs, but we were seeing a lot of heavy Hunter comps. What's really been pushing them into the forefront here?
So I think just their mass amount of AoE damage, with how Corruption ends up working out, they run a lot of Severe Corruption, which is the critical damage percent amplifier. And then they also have like rapid reload, so they have their Aspect of the Wild cooldown up available for everything. And then in addition to that, Freehold is explosive, and Beast Mastery Hunter is not exactly terrible at killing with explosives. I think all things considered, Freehold is probably a double Death Knight dungeon, but whenever you do add that explosive affix in, the double Hunter becomes a little bit more of a reliable comp.
Well, not to mention it's also bolstering too,
yeah.
so
Yeah.
you really aren't going to see double Unholy DK on bolstering because you aren't going to be able to pull as big trash mobs, and you're not going to be able to pull trash mobs into bosses, which is what Unholy DKs are good at doing. So it's not surprising to see more Hunters come in and not DKs.
Yeah, and dude, speaking of pulling into bosses, let's start looking at that Toldagor run, because there were some massive pulls that they just completely obliterated on.
Yeah, so we actually did see how they ended up running the Blood of the Corruptor there, and like utilizing line of sight to be able to deal with those eyeballs. And then in addition to that, they utilized the cannons. Just the cannon utilization with how large they were pulling, especially in the teaming setting. That is where Perplexed made up most of their time, is just how they were able to work with those cannons. Utilizing tricks of the trade and everything like that to be able to deal with it. And then from there, it's just making sure that you're consistent with Overseer Corgus.
It was a number of times where, you know, the whole run can almost depend on how large they're pulling with some of those cannon shots, and because they're only restricted to 5 shots, there's really just no margin for error throughout a lot of these runs that we've seen. You know, when we look at the next series coming up, though, Tyrannical, Explosive, Bolstering, we've seen a lot of times, Ironic, where just the sheer amount of extra affixes they have to deal with turns this very easy, very common dungeon everybody knows and loves into just absolute nightmare sometimes.
Well, it was funny because, you know, a lot of the Limit players are doing the MDI this time around, and they were joking in our Discord, how are they going to make us do Freehold slower? And then they saw you got Explosive Bolstering, and they're like, oh, yeah, that's
Why
how
did
they'll
you
do
ask?
it. That's how they'll slow it down. Yeah, Freehold is probably going to be 3 to 4 minutes slower with these affixes. It's pretty ridiculous how much more difficult these two particular affixes are than just about every single other one.
Yeah, seeing affixes sort of changing week to week in many ways is also going to be a huge pain for some teams, and it also kind of show off the skills of some others ones, because we've seen a number of times, Tettles, where you start looking at Freehold, you start looking at some of the other dungeons like a Taldazar, where there's a lot of different levels of HP for some of the mobs, and how much they have to be more precise with the damage.
I mean, it really uproots like how you're thinking about the dungeon. You just really need to make sure that you're pulling even health mobs, or if there are mismatched, cleaving off of the higher health stuff. So like for Freehold, an example, the enforcers in that dungeon are significantly higher HP than a lot of the other mobs, so making sure that you cleave off of those is important. Or for Harlan Sweet's case, maybe you don't use the cannonball barrage that you get on him to be able to kill the trash. You just utilize some normal strategy where you kill all the trash prior to him. More of like a live-esque strategy.
Right, and we saw, what was it, 2 of the obelisks being pulled with Corgus at the end. Nagura, do you think there's going to be 2 or maybe even 3 as a possibility on the last boss in Freehold?
I think so, for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the Awaken affix and how many of those Awaken mobs you can pull with the last boss is going to be whoever team wins, right? It's a really, really big risk to play 3 or even 4 Awaken mobs with the last boss, but if you can pull it off, you're saving so much time, because these single target mobs have so much HP, and it takes you so long, and you can't pull any other trash on top of it to make it more efficient, because you're of course in a different realm. So being able to pull more Awaken mobs with the last boss is gonna be the key, I believe, especially in this Freehold.
Freehold has been one of those dungeons that we've always tried to figure it out. We've always had always a lot of consistency with, in terms of the strategies, in terms of the pulling and everything like that. You think that it's going to be a much closer game on this one between Perplexed and Puolukka's Ironic, or has it just been the execution for Perplexed? It's going to be tough to beat.
I think it's hard to say. I think running one Unholy DK in this dungeon, and even on Bolstering, even on Explosive, is still incredibly good because, you don't have to kill all the mobs you pull. Unholy DK can just bring them down to a point where you can then start to pick off mobs or focus a higher health mob, and that's what the Hunter's going to be good for. They have a really good damage comp with just the one Unholy DK. I think they have a higher potential damage output, and of course then a higher potential chance to do the dungeon faster, so I'm still thinking Perplexed is going to do better here, but one small mistake or the Unholy DK doing too much damage, and that Bolstering can get out of hand quickly.
Without a doubt. And we've seen, as Tettles, you were mentioning earlier with the corruption that teams were running, and have we seen too much corruption over 40%? I've seen a couple of things from Beyond spawning, but maybe not as much as I was expecting.
So I think generally hunters and rogues are able to run a significant amount of corruption. There are some teams, I know, for example, Self-Reliance really does not like going over 40. None of the tanks should really be going over 40, and none of the healers should really be going over 40. But if in your DPS slot, as long as like the slow isn't like inhibiting, or they feel comfortable like dealing with the thing from beyond, like hunters and rogues are able to fairly easily, then it shouldn't be too bad. There are also other classes like Demon Hunter and whatnot that are like really free with thing from beyond. I think it's almost like a dungeon per dungeon, a fix per fix, and like class by class basis though at the end of the day. But we did see a lot of just coming out of this hunters there from that last match. I know Farouche was playing it. We've seen I think Swagstep was also playing thing from beyond. I think both of those were playing over 40 corruption. They were playing a lot of gushing wound traits from what I'm seeing currently.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of, Mistweavers especially running tons of different gushing wounds traits as well. So Freehold going to be starting off our second game of the series, excuse me, with Tyrannical, Bolstering, and Explosive onto this one. And as we mentioned, if you guys are just tuning in, corruptions in the game, Awakened has been the seasonal affix that we've been dealing with, and a lot of times we're just not seeing as many rogues, but first two series are both going to be featuring them, maybe for a lot of the control we saw in Tol Dagor, but even then, not nearly as much as we'd see in Fire Nagura.
Yeah, we definitely are going to see less rogues. I did talk to some of the teams about what's going to be the best comps, and they did say rogues are probably going to be seen less just because they didn't scale as well as some of the other classes with this corruption. And of course, rogues are still strong for certain affixes like like Explosive, for example. And you're still gonna see rogues if you want to do things like snapping, because they're just very good at doing that kind of stuff, putting the tricks of the trade on the tank and then just stealthing around, pulling mobs on top of the tank. So for those kind of shenanigans, we're still gonna see rogues. But overall, their overall strength, DPS-wise and utility-wise, now with the Awakened affix as well, making Shroud less important, is definitely gonna be lower this time around.
Yeah, like you mentioned, it's still incredibly to have at least one rogue in your group just for this, the Shroud right here, as well as all of the lockdown you mentioned before. But we're not going to be seeing double rogue comps almost at all, I don't think, because you don't need that much utility, and the amount of damage you get from running Unholy and Hunter in general is just way higher. And I think the corruption system that we were talking about also kind of allows you to add even more classes in. For these dungeons where it's incredibly difficult to run 4 obelisks on the final boss, classes like Fire Mage could be incredibly strong for that, with Combust, with all of this masterful corruption you can have on the tournament realm, probably being the highest 4 or 5 target bursts in the game. So there's a lot of interesting options that open up with this corruption system and these players being allowed to have the perfect corruption for their class. I'm interested to see how the meta will develop as we move forward in the season.
Yeah, this is going to be super interesting. We see Puolukka already fighting the boss. They did a little bit of a smaller pool compared to Perplexed here, as they only had the 13% trash, while Perplexed has 22%. And Puolukka also committed their Bloodlust to this very first pool, while Perplexed is holding theirs. Oh, okay, so they're actually using the Bloodlust here for the boss. Interesting.
Yeah, they held it until after that first charge from Sky Captain Crag, and then they were able to just start going. They probably should only get one more of these charges, which will do a lot of single target damage to one person. You saw Ashine getting chunked down to 60% health there, and then they aren't going to have to deal with pretty much anything else now. They'll spread out around the boss for those shots, and their healer will go far to bait the pools, and it's just a single target boss where individual single players will be taking some burst damage.
Yeah, this is interesting to see. Now we can actually see how good hunters are, especially in Freehold, because in the past we've seen full melee setups, but now with this range coming in, hunters, of course, PM hunters, they don't lose any damage from moving, so seeing them baiting the pulls here on the side, not having to have the healer be outside, which is really helpful, not only because it increases your DPS, because the healer can actually damage the boss, but also makes it easier for the healer with less movement being involved.
Yeah, I think I was sucking last season. I'm just too used to seeing the healers go out there. I don't think there's a well, the green healer's in melee now, not in range. Yeah, like you mentioned, Hunter is just such a useful class in terms of utility. They can do a lot of stuff on their own, and the damage on top of that now just makes it such a good single target class. Now, of course, when Unholy DK has Army of the Dead available and Bloodlust on top of that, they can pump out some real single target damage as well. But generally speaking, you can see the damage differential on both sides of the screen right now as to how much stronger these other DPS classes are in general versus the Rogue.
Yeah, you can see how much faster Puolukka actually dealt with that boss here, as they're already downed it now. They're going to move on. Let's see what they do with this Enforcer here. Looks like they're pulling it, but probably not going to deal with it. I assume they're going to Shadow Melt it off, because this Enforcer does have a lot of HP, and with Bolstering, you probably don't want to deal with a mob that slowly moves. So I assume they're just going to Shadow Melt off the aggro, see how big of a pull they're doing, as Perplexed also dealt with the first boss. And you see Ashine is actually not in range of the group, because Shine already left the first boss early to trigger the event at the Ring of Booty. So instead of finishing off the boss, Ashine actually just moved on to that Ring of Booty, because there's a small little role-playing event that happens that costs you a little bit of time, and that's why you see the Rogue actually not being here.
Do you think he also already drank the beer on the way through so that they can pull the boss? He did. Wow. He just left instantly to go do it. So they're ready to pull this boss the second he gets back, and it looks like they're gearing up to do it. Once again, I mean, they're not going to pull it with the trash. Obviously, they don't want to bolster the boss. But once they have this trash down, they're ready to go on the boss whenever they want to.
Yeah,
so
they
just
are
go straight
engaging
into
the
the
boss
boss
now with the Trapper, actually. So this means they're probably not going to finish off this Trapper. They're just going to leave it there for Cleave, I assume. So very interesting strat by Perplexed. This is also pretty dangerous. Now, this time around, we don't actually have Eudora, so it's a little bit less dangerous, because Eudora is the one boss that does this huge single target burst shot, powder shot. So not having Eudora is definitely a big relief to do those kind of pulls. As we see Puolukka now also engaging the boss, but they dealt with the Awaken mob first.
Yeah, interesting to see just little slight differences in strategy, and it might be one of those things where Perplexed is looking to deal with all 4 of the obelisks on the final boss, whereas Puolukka is not as comfortable doing that. They're going to end up dealing with 3 or possibly even 2 on the final boss, and it's going to come down to whether or not Perplexed is going to be able to pull that pull off. And, you know, just little differences in strategy, that's what the Awakened affixes bring. You're allowed a lot more changes within the dungeon. You can change your route a lot with those obelisks.
Yeah, and we saw interesting on Perplexed side, Smok was actually taunting out the Trapper, the rat, to the side, because it was low HP. They didn't want it to die to bolster the bosses, so he taunted it out, put a Ring of Peace, and now they succeeded with, I believe, a blind. So they need to be careful because of explosive though, because succeed mobs can still spawn explosives, so we'll see how to deal with those. And I think that's gonna be the role of the rogues really in both those teams, to deal with those explosive burst casts. Explosive, sorry, because rogues just are so good for it. They can cleave off of the explosive, and they don't lose any damage from doing so. So that's why rogues are actually so good at dealing with them.
And also the Hunter utility, little freezing trap coming out after they had to deal with that explosive as well. So they have a lot of lockdown CC here. And of course, I think they'll bring it in once the bosses get probably sub 10, sub 50%, along with this other trash, that three pack at the back of the room that we were talking about earlier. And it's not really too surprising. As long as they don't end up bolstering the bosses when they're on too high of HP, totally doable, and this also lets the Unholy DK kind of come back a little bit. The interesting thing though is you can see, because of the way they're pulling this, it doesn't really allow the Unholy DK to shine damage-wise at all. You can see that their tank is second on the damage meter right now, doing a ton of damage.
Yeah, and we see 2 different strategies as well coming in from those 2 teams, as Puolukka actually was focusing down one boss first, and then they only have Jolly left now, so now they're pulling trash on top of Jolly, utilizing the brews that are being thrown out. Now you see those swirls on the floor, those are positive brews, or there's either crit buff, haste buff, or a debuff, a negative brew, that also affects the mobs, and they're utilizing this buff to pull the trash on top of it, and they have to do it at the very end of the fight, because of course it is bolstering, so you don't want to bolster the boss, and that's why they did it at the very end. While Perplexed, as we saw earlier, we're pulling the trash on top and then seeing it away. So 2 different strategies coming in from those 2 teams, as Perplexed is already moving on to do a pretty big pull here. They have to be careful because of those different amounts of HPs, as we mentioned earlier.
Yep, and they do a fantastic job of getting the giant down first, the most HP mob, and then they can sort of cleave down the rest of these tiny mobs when they're at 5 to 10% HP. Something interesting to mention as well, I think, is that when you look at tank corruptions, there's a lot of variability in what they run. They can run a lot of different setups in terms of what they feel like they need to do. In a dungeon where they really want to make sure their survival is key, we see a lot of tanks running versatility percentage corruptions on top of running one of those surging vitality traits, which gives you a large amount of flat versatility whenever you take damage, so that they actually end up having about something like 37 to 40% versatility, which is a 20% DR. That's a lot of damage reduction for a tank. But actually in this dungeon, which I think is interesting, Divine Field is running a Twilight Devastation rank 3 as well as a Gushing Wounds. So he's all in on damage. I guess that he just doesn't really feel that he's in danger in this dungeon at all. That's a big offensive play for them.
Yeah, it really depends on, because the more the tank can actually tank, obviously the more damage your group is going to do, because if the tank needs to start kiting because he won't survive the melee hits anymore, then the mobs are going to start spreading out, you don't hit all of your cleave anymore, you need to help the tank surviving, and the tank also doesn't do any damage while he's kiting, of course. So if you can min-max your corruption properly, because of course Twilight Devastation is the offensive one and Gushing Wounds, while on the other hand having the versatility one is more of a defensive corruption, but it allows you to do those bigger pulls and not having to kite. But as you see, Divine Field is doing those big pulls and is not kiting, so definitely a very risk-reward kind of strategy here coming in by Divine Field. And we see doing a very interesting pull as they pull the Demolishers on top of Ludwig here.
But it's also paying off for them right now because they're a pretty solid amount ahead. They're at about the exact, maybe a little bit behind on Ludwig in terms of percentage right now, but they're also 10% of their trash percentage ahead, as well as doing about the exact same pulls. So if they're able to pull off their pulls, they should be able to take the lead here and, take this series 2-0. But like we mentioned, it's a lot more risky. The tank could go down a lot more easily than, for instance, Click could on the other side. So we'll have to keep an eye on that. Divine is actually probably the person you want to watch on Team Perplexed.
Yeah, definitely. And one small little thing to mention about this pull that they're doing here is Ludwig does not actually bolstering. So Ludwig has some weird interaction where even if mobs die around Ludwig, he's not bolstering any of those mobs. And that's why you saw them doing this kind of pull where you had all different kinds of HP mobs. They still tried to kill the trash as even as possible because, of course, the other mobs are bolstering each other. So they still try to kill it at the same time. But bolstering a boss or a mini-boss like Ludwig is bad, and that's why they still did this pull, because they know that it doesn't actually bolster.
Yep, and I mean, these teams are pretty much doing the exact same pulls. It's almost like Freehold was completely figured out. So this is probably the most figured out dungeons I think of any of the dungeons. This is one of the quickest dungeons that these teams have done, maybe aside from Dagor. And it's kind of surprising to see how fast they're going with the affixes. Like we mentioned, are probably two of these worst affixes in terms of slowing the down, and these teams are shooting the breeze here. They're taking it easy. They're just breezing through the dungeon easily. So I don't know, it's really surprising how practiced and how good these teams are on day one of the 2020 season.
Yeah, and I'm surprised by Puolukka, to be honest, because as you see, Puolukka is not far behind at all. They're slightly behind on trash percentage and 1% behind on boss HP. Now we know they have more single target damage whenever the DK does not have the cooldowns up, then the Hunter are going to be out DPSing it, and it looked really close, especially because Puolukka did deal with one of the Awakened mobs, while Perplexed, as far as I'm aware, ignored all of the Awakened mobs so far. So theoretically, Puolukka is going to have an easier time pulling the last boss, as they have to deal with one less mob.
Again, we're seeing that Hunter utility coming out. They can just do all of the damage on the move and kite those sharks around so that their healer doesn't have to deal with. Increases the overall group DPS. In the past, this was something that's had to deal with, but Hunter, it's free damage for the group, letting your healer sit in melee and also do damage. So just one of the other benefits to having Hunters in your group. You can see that right here.
Yeah, I'm sure the healers are going to be very grateful for the meta to change and actually allowing ranged or hunters into their comp. That's why I mentioned earlier, just Freehold is one of those dungeons where you can really see the utility of the hunter coming out. Also on the last boss, where you have those ads spawn once in a while that fixate a person and explode on impact, those can also be dealt with the hunter traps, the freezing traps. Not only can they slow them, but they can also hard to see them. So we'll see that later as we reach the last boss. They both have their bloodlust ready, and I assume they're just saving it for this very last pull with the Awakened mobs.
Yeah, and I mean, once again, pulling mobs on top of the boss, you don't have to really worry about bolstering when the boss is so low, because it's only based off of current HP, so not really anything you can worry about here. The Unholy DK can just go ahead and cleave everything down. Not really, a whole lot left to do for them. Is they just have to worry about explosive and not killing things too quickly so the bolstering doesn't get too bad.
Yeah, and both teams still 0 deaths, so very clean run by them. We did mention that this is a time trial dungeon, so they of course had a little bit more practice for this dungeon than for the non-time trial dungeons. As we saw earlier, Dagor was not a time trial dungeon. Now both of them are downing Trophic here as they're going to be moving on. Perplexed slightly ahead in percentage as they have 4%, and also keep in mind that Perplexed needs to do less overall percentage because they have all 4 awakened pillars still there, meaning they will get the full percentage from all of the awakened mobs, while Puolukka actually dealt with 1. So they have to do a little bit more trash still to catch up to Perplexed, as Perplexed is pulling those Ravager trash groups, which basically they deal with themselves with the Painful Motivation casts.
Yep, and it's important to mention that the awakened obelisk mobs are worth an exact 4 count in each dungeon. So depending on how much trash count you need in each dungeon, it's usually around 8 to 10%. So that should finish off the trash count for Team Perplexed, like you mentioned. All they have to do is pull off this one final pull.
They lost Ashine. So Ashine died. I'm not really sure what happened, but Ashine immediately released. Now he's back to the group, but that actually cost him quite a bit of time now. I assume they also had to Shadow Melt off one of the Buccaneers here because the Painful Motivation did not apply to all of the mobs, and of course it is Bolstering, so this Buccaneer was really highly bolstered because the other mobs died to the Painful Motivation cast. So they had to Shadow Melt off, they needed to wait for a Shine to come back, and now they have to do this pull again. So this cost them quite a bit of time messing up this Painful Motivation cast to not hit the correct targets. So we see on the other side Puolukka is already getting ready to do the last boss pull.
Yeah, and I mean, that could cost them here. These teams are so close together. If Perplexed doesn't perfectly get this final pull down, they're going to have some issues. So, and they also have very little room to maneuver too because they already have their 100% trash count. They're not going to want to deal with those mobs in the center of the room that we saw a lot last year. So keep an eye on their positioning here. This is going to be really dangerous for them.
Here we see Puolukka is already popping that Blalas, dealing with those 3 mobs at the same time. You see Click going down actually. This is really bad for them as they don't actually have a Battle Rest class. So they need to use the Engineering Rest, which just takes longer than a Battle Rest from another. As Sinky also goes down, this might be a disaster for them.
Oh man. Yeah, that's all she wrote for that pull. Now, if the Hunters can get out of combat and feign death, they can try to get off, but they also can't res afterwards, so there's not a whole lot going for them there. What is Zmog? Oh, what is this strategy from Team Perplexed? He is just kiting the 4 awakened mobs so that they don't ever have to deal with them, and the rest of the group is just dealing with Harlan Sweet.
I love this.
This is actually insane. I mean, they don't need to kill these. You don't have to actually kill the awakened mobs for the dungeon to finish. They already have their 100% trash count. So if they kill the boss without Zmog there, they're totally fine. What an interesting strategy from them. This is actually insane.
This is an awesome idea because, I mean, this boss does do a decent amount of AoE damage whenever he casts this barrage, as you just saw, but Death Knight can deal with it really easily. They have so much self-healing, and Rogues, of course, we know they don't have to deal with any damage income at all. They have so many self-defensives, and Hunters as well. They have a lot of self-healing. Now, as long as Divine Field doesn't die, and as you can see, Divine Field is just tanking quite a lot here to be able to not get too much incoming damage. This is such an interesting strategy, and Smok, I mean, it's obviously very difficult for Smok to do the kiting, right? Because he needs to not be in range of the spider, else he's gonna get one of those huge damaging casts go through. And he also needs to constantly dispel the fear off of him, of course, to not get the CC in.
And I want to bring back the point we were making earlier that Divine Field is running purely offensive traits right now. Rank 3 Twilight Dev and a Gushing Wounds. He doesn't have anything that's increasing his survivability. So when Harlan Sweet hits that 30% mark and gains 100% attack speed, Divine Field is going to drop quickly. Of course, he does have his defensive cooldowns available, so he should be totally fine because also the boss takes double damage. But at the same time, this is a awesome strategy. I'm glad we get to see this and play it. Smok is just out here running in circles, you know, just chilling. He's vibing hard out here.
I love this strategy. One more thing to mention, of course, is also that the Tank Buster does not actually cast the Spirit Breaker, I believe it's called, if you're not in range, right? So it will just follow you around as we see it happening right here. And the spider as well, it will start casting on you once you're in range, but if you walk out of range while it's casting, it will not actually finish the cast. So this is a perfectly viable strategy. The only thing that will be dangerous is dealing with the explosives that they spawn, but he's doing such a good job. This is crazy.
I mean, there it is. Perfect execution. Interesting strategy from Team Perplexed. I don't think we've seen anything that interesting from a team in a long time. These guys are really pulling out the stops.
Incredible, unbelievable performance there by Perplexed. And Dagor, remember before this, I was like, oh, I wonder how many they're going to deal with. Maybe 2, maybe 3. It's going to be really